Hello and welcome to the REST API testing with Cypress. In the next 1 hour, I'm going to teach you how to set up a testing project, how to make API calls with Cypress, how to read and work with response objects, and of course, how to perform assertions or providing an access token. First, we need to create a new Cypress project. I've already created one and named it Cypress API Testing. The steps to create a new project are very simple. First, open terminal and type npm init and flag of yes. This will pretty much create a new empty project based on Node.js. Then we need to install dependencies. In our case, you will type npm install Cypress. And in my case, I'm also using Prettier, but this one is optional. Prettier is again only for the code formatting, and me personally prefer automated code formatting, but if you don't want to use it, you don't need to. It will not affect any of the Cypress functionality. But if you want to use it, as me, then just add one more dependency, which is named Prettier, and hit enter. After everything is downloaded and installed for you, you can simply create a new Prettier file here named .prettierrc. And here, as you can see, I have prepared my configuration, which is semi-false and single quotes to true. Again, Prettier offers much more than this, but for my purposes, this is enough for me because I don't like semicolons and I prefer to use single quotes. But again, you can override it to your preferred automated code formatting options. The final step is to basically init the Cypress, and for that just type npx Cypress open, and if you are opening Cypress for the first time, it will basically open it and automatically install you and create these folders here. And as you can see, we have an end-to-end folder where I have just created a simple api.sci.js spec file, which is just this simple describe block, nothing inside. We will start working completely from scratch. Next, we need to a little bit set up our configuration. So let me close the terminal. Let me close the spec for now, and let's focus on the Cypress config. Here you can see we have this end-to-end, and we can leave it also for the API testing, but we can remove the setup node events. It's not needed for our testing project. Here we need to set up a few things. First is base URL. And you might ask what URL we'll be using. So let me show you. And the backend or the API we'll be testing is this regress.in. As you can see, it's basically a live backend. It's a live server with a lot of endpoints. And if you scroll down, you can see we have basically a fake backend, which is free to use. You can use it not just for the testing or purposes of learning API testing. You can also use it for your, let's say, front-end application. If you don't have any backend, you are basically free to use it. Regress will provide us with multiple endpoints and also a documentation. So basically you can test them out and do whatever you want with them. The server is live, but it will not affect anything. So you can use it as much as you want and don't worry about it. So let me just grab the URL and let's paste it in our base URL config. And since we are working with API and you take a look here at the endpoints, you see that all of them pretty much starts with /API. So for that, we can also add this to the base URL. So we have request.in/API and also the next slash. Next, just a slight modification. We want to screenshot on run failure to false, and also video to false, because for API testing we are basically not working with a UI, so these are pretty much useless. And that's all. Our configuration for the project is now ready, so we can close the config and we can open our API spec file and start exploring Cypress testing of REST API. So let's start with including the reference type of Cypress at the top. So // reference types equals Cypress. And now let's change describe block to some meaningful name. In our case, for example, learn REST API testing with Cypress. And now we will basically start with calling our first request. And if you want to call a Cypress request, you can do just cy.request. And as you can see, we need to provide a URL as a parameter. And by default, if you do not provide any other arguments, this simple cy.request will always call a get request. So let's go to our website. And for example, we would like to call a get request for a singular user. So as you can see, the URL will be /users/ and the number or ID of the user. So let's go back here. And we want to provide the URL. And the URL is users. And for example, we will take the second user. And we are just appending the /user/2 because, as you can see, we have provided the base URL in the configuration of the Cypress. So what's next? Now we are simply telling to Cypress to call a get request on this endpoint. And we are expecting some response. So we need to do .then. And inside, we want to get the response object. Also the name actually doesn't matter because this then will always get us the response. This is just the name of the variable. But it's common practice to name it something like response to keep it in the context. And now what I want to do, I basically want to log or console log my response to see what the endpoint actually is sending to us. And the easiest way is to call cy.log. And of course, we want to make the response like human readable, so we need to stringify it. So for that, we have a function called JSON stringify, and we will provide it with the response. And here you have multiple options. You can simply log the complete response like this. Oops, sorry. Response. Or you can just target the response header or response body. Something like .headers or .body. And you can also chain it much more. For example, if you want to return something like ID, you can do body.id. And if the ID is a value which is returned by the response from that API endpoint, it will get displayed. But right now, we don't know what data is coming with the response. So what we can do is just log the complete response body and see what's coming from that response. So let's now open terminal, npx Cypress open. And here, let's click on our configured end-to-end testing. Let's start testing in Chrome. And click on our API spec. And as you can see, our test passed, and we have logged all the response body data. So as you can see, it's giving us a data object which contains multiple data such as ID, email, first name, last name, avatar, and much more. So right now, imagine I want to console log just the email value which is coming as a response of this user with ID 2. What I can do, I can go back here and let me close the terminal. And right now I know the body is coming with something like data object. So I can type response.body.data and the value is email. And now if I call this get request again, and I want to log the response, that body, the data, that email, the Cypress will only console log this email data. So let's save it, and let's go back to Cypress, which is here. And as you can see, the test run again, so we can also run it. And as you can see, after this request, we logged just the email value. And in very similar way, you can log the header. So let me show you. We can also create one more log. So let's just copy paste it. And here I'm going to change it to headers. And save it. And now, as you can see, the test automatically run again. And first we are logging the value of the email from the body. And now also we are logging out the complete header data which came from that request. So this way you can always basically take a look of what is coming out of that endpoint. Again, it's nothing complicated. You just call the endpoint and the endpoint is giving you back some response. And you can simply log the response data so you can see what's coming there. I know in terms of API testing, this is not the test because we are not validating anything, but don't worry. In the next few minutes, I'm gonna show you how to not just log this data, but how to start performing multiple assertions. And we will start with a simple one, such as validating the headers or status codes of the requests, and slowly we will build up and do more advanced assertions also on the data content, etc. So this is pretty much all for the console logging these responses. So we can close it for now. And we can start with some assertions. So first, typical assertion which you want to use in the API testing is status code or response headers. So first, let's start with the response headers. So I'm going to create a new test and I'm going to give it a description, API tests, and validate headers. So what do we want to do? Again, we want to call the GET request on this endpoint. Then we will get the response, but instead of just console logging the data, we want to perform assertions that some of the headers are actually included correctly in that response. So let's start sci.request. And again, we want to hit /users. And let's stay with the user2. And typically, you want to create an alias for that response. So I'm gonna do that as, and I'm just gonna name it, for example, user. And now I can perform sci.get, and now I can target that alias, in this case, user. So I'm pretty much targeting the response from that request. And now I want to assert that it's headers. And for example, now I can target any values. So I would like to again call its content type, for example. And now should include, and what can be the value? Typically it needs to require application/JSON, and save it. And if you take a look at the code, at first it might be a little bit confusing, but let me again explain step by step. First, we call this GET request on this endpoint, and we store it as Cypress alias of user. Then we get the response from that user endpoint, and we take a look at its headers, at its content type, and then we assert that it should include application JSON. And you may be asked, how do I know that there is a content type of application JSON? At first, you will see it if you basically console log the headers like we have done in the previous video. So now when we open terminal and restart the Cypress, again, let's go to end-to-end testing. And now if you run the API test again, you can see that both of our tests passed. And if you open the validate headers, you can see that we basically call this endpoint, we store it as a user alias, then we get the response, we take a look at its headers, its content type, and we expected application/JSON charset UTF-8 to include application JSON. And now if you take a look at our first test, where we actually console logged the value of the header, you can see that the value of content type is here and application JSON is here. So now if you want to write some extra test for its header, you can pretty much take a look of what headers are coming, or you should know what headers should be coming, and then you can write the same assertion like the test here and just compare the values of expected and actual are correct. So let's go back to our VS Code, and if I close the terminal, now let's say there is a situation you want to add one more validation for the headers, and for that you can simply call one more site.get, and again we can target our user's response, and we can do the pretty much same thing. We can call its headers, and for example its connection, and again should include keep alive. And now we have pretty much the same response but two different assertions. And if we go back to the browser and rerun our tests, you can see that our tests are still passing, and now we have the second assertion, which is here. So this way you don't need to worry about how many assertions you have. You can always get the same response using this alias. So let's go back. As you can see, you just create one request, store it as the alias, and now you can perform multiple assertions in this way. Just get the response, and then you pick what you want to assert from the response. In this case, we are asserting content type and connection, both from the headers. And again, API tests are very fast, so you don't need to worry of how many assertions you have. You can do assertions pretty much on everything what is coming out of those responses. So that's all for the headers, and let's now move on the status codes, which is again very important part of API testing. Let's now take a look on how to actually test and assert the API status codes. So again, I'm gonna create one more test, and I'm gonna give it a description, API test, status codes. So we can again take this request. So we will be basically extending these tests, and we will be trying to assert the status codes. And I'm going to show you both positive and both negative ways on how to do it. So again, I'm gonna call site.request, and I'm gonna provide it with that URL. And first, let's start with the positive scenario. So we will call a get request on the existing endpoint. In this case, it's users/2, and we know that this one exists. And again, we can save it, as, let's say, existing user. And now, how to actually assert the status code? Well, again, sci.get, because we want to get the response. And we want to take it from existing user. And we'll take a look at it. In this case, the value is status. And again, we want to perform assertion, in this case should, but we need to take a look at equal, because we are asserting the exact value. And the value is 200. And as you know, the status code of 200 means that we successfully get the response. So now save it. And let's go back to the Cypress tests. And as you can see, our tests already passed because they are automatically being rerun. And if I rerun them again, you can see we have this third test and it's passing. And if we take a look at its detail, we can see that we again requested the endpoint. We store it as an alias and we are targeting its status and we are expecting 200 to equal 200. Again, pretty simple. Very often, if you are testing positive scenarios, you are looking at the 200 status. So let's now take a look on the opposite, and we will try to validate and assert a non-existing user. So we are expecting the 404, which means not found. And here comes a small catch. Let me show you. So let's go back to the VS Code. And down here, I'm going to do the same. Sci.request. And now I want to target some non-existing URL. And also we need to do slight modification to the request parameters. So let me show you. You can basically override the default parameters by providing the object of options. As you can see, you can basically override the values here using this object and providing it with some values. So we can give it the URL of /users, and now I need to find some user which is not existing. In this case, it can be something like this, because we know that /nonexist doesn't exist on this server. And next, we of course need to put another value, which is fail on status code. And give it values of false, because right now we are trying to assert the failed code, and if we didn't put this into that parameter, the test will fail even before it reach this assertion. So again, let's save it as, for example, non-existing user. And now let's go down here and we call sci.get and we get alias of non-existing user, and we will replicate the same. We want to take its status, but now we want to assert that its value equal 404. So let's now go back into the Cypress and rerun the tests again. And as you can see, all our tests are still passing. But if we take a detail of this status code, we can see when we call the request on the non-existing user, we are getting the 404 not found. And also we successfully asserted that the value of the status code is correct. So this is very simple and straightforward way on how you can assert the status code. Again, asserting status codes is very common practice, and along with validating the headers is very first thing which we'll be asserting while performing API testing. And as you can see with Cypress, it's really easy. You just call the endpoint and you validate its status, and you basically assert that the response number is the expected number you are expecting from that API endpoint. Just remember that if you are asserting the negative scenarios, you need to provide it with fail on status code false, otherwise the test will fail even before it reaches its assertion. I know this is quite strange behavior, but this is how does Cypress work right now. So that's what we need to do. I know it would be better if it would go directly to this assertion, even if the request would be like status code which starts as 400, which are the failed codes basically. But that's nothing we can do right now besides switching status code to false. So that's it for the status code, and in the next few tests we will take a look on how to validate and assert the response body and the actual data itself from the GET request, POST request, PUT, and of course delete. So let's move on, and now we can start testing the response body and its actual data. So let me create one more test, and again I'm going to give it some description: API test GET request. So now what we want to do, again we will basically call this request on this users slash and some ID and store it as a user. So again I'm going to call users slash 2, and you know what, let me just modify it a little bit. I will override the options using parameters. So I'm gonna provide it with a URL of users slash 2, and also now I want to set up the method. In this case the method will be get, and I'm gonna store it as a user. And again, now you see one more parameter which you can provide to the, oh sorry, not get, it should be request, so my bad, I'm sorry. And now basically we are telling this request to call this URL by using get method. But you already know that if you do not specify this method, it will automatically be a get. But now we are just putting it so you can see its actual get. But if you don't put it into the request, nothing is gonna happen. So now let's again grab it. So sci.get, let's grab the user. And now after we get this, I want to call then, because we will be performing multiple actions. So I'm gonna keep it just res as a shortcut for response. And first thing I will typically do is logging up the response body, so I know what the values are coming from that endpoint. So let's do it. Sci.log, and again JSON stringify, and we want to pull out response.body. So again, this is like a typical way of how to do it. And one more thing, let me put it .only, so we will run only this request. So let's go back to the Cypress. And now, as you can see, we have performed the API test get request, and as you can see, we have only logged this response.body. So what we see here is that we are getting some data object which contains all of these values. So typical assertion, what I can see now, which we can perform, is asserting that if I call this users slash 2, I'm getting the ID of the user, and the ID should be the same as the ID I am providing to the request. In this case, 2. So let's write assertion for that. Let's go back to the VS Code. And down here, let's put one more assertion. In this case, we can use expect. And we basically expect that response dot body dot data dot id pretty much equal to number 2, because we are asserting that the id should be 2. And as you can see, now we need to basically dive deep into that object to get the ID. We cannot just write expect data.id, because the ID itself is basically like included in the response, its body, its data object, and its ID. You know, it's basically like a tree of values inside each other. So we need to write properly, like response.body.data.id equal to 2. So now let's take a look at the browser. And as you can see, we have assertion here, and we basically expected 2 to equal 2. So that's pretty much how you create a simple assertion on the data. So let's put one more. And let's say I also want to assert its email. So again, I will do the same, expect response.body.data.email. And typically I can call, for example, for contain. But right now I don't know the value, so we need to take a look. And the value here is Janet Weaver. So we can take it and put it into the contain, just like this. Now, if we take a look, we can see that the test passed. So let's also rerun it. And we have expected that the email is including the email address. So that's pretty much it. There is one more example I need to show you, and that is also the negative assertion, where we assert that something does not contain some values. Again, I think you already know how to do it. But let's say I want to assert that the last name does not contain some value. So I will again add one more expect, and I target response.body.data.last name. And here I need to call that not to contain. Oops, small mistake. For example, some funny name. So basically, if you want to do some reverse assertion that something does not include it, you can just put that not, and the rest is again the same. Now, if we take a look again, you can see that we expected the last name Weaver not to include some funny name. So that's it. As you can see, asserting a request body is very easy. You just call the request, store it as an alias, then you get the alias and return its response. First, you can console log out values, so you actually know what values are coming. And then you can do multiple expect assertions. It can be 1, it can be 2, or it can be for all of the data itself from that endpoint. This is pretty much up to you. But now you can see how to do it. There is just one more small tip. You can also store this response body data into variables and pass them into expect, just to keep your code a little bit more cleaner. So let me show you. Here I can pretty much create a variable. For example, user ID, and value will be response.body.data.id. And now I can call expect. Sorry, it should be user, not either. User ID to equal 1. And as you can see, this assertion is exactly the same like this assertion. Well, but sorry, it should be 2. So now it will be passing. So if you think this response.body.data is not readable, or in some case the tree can be a little bit longer, always in that case you can just store that value into variable, so it's much more readable, and then you just provide that variable into the assertion, and the result is the same. So if we take a look, you can see that both this and both this assertion is passing. So just small recapitulation. again, we call the request of get, store it as an alias of user. Then we get the alias and then we return some response. First, we basically console log out our values. Then we pick some values which we want to assert. And then we provide multiple expect assertions. If we think that this data or this is not readable, we can always store these values into variables with much more readable name and then pass that variables into the assertions to make our code much more cleaner. So now let's take a look on the post request, which is a little bit more complicated than typical GET request because we need to provide also the values which we want to send on the server or on that API endpoint. But don't worry, again, with Cypress, everything is pretty easy. So first, let me remove this .only because we want to create, again, one more test. And in this case, it's API test. And it's post request. So what we will try to actually post. So if we go back on this, our fake server, we can see that we have these two post endpoints, one for login successful and one for login unsuccessful. This is very nice example of a post request because login is typically a post request. So let's take a look on how to actually do it. And if you take a look at this small documentation, you can see that if we hit the /login endpoint and we provide it with email and password, we should get response to 100 and also the token. And since this is a fake data, this token should be always the same for this email and password. So let's go back to the VS Code. And first thing we want to do is to actually, again, call site.request. Now we need to provide an object of like values. So in this case, again, let's start with URL. And the endpoint was /login. And now we need to change the method. So the method should be post. And of course, now we need to provide it with the body. And the body itself is object. And here we will send the values of username and password. So in this case, it was email. And the second value was password. So let's go back and take a look at the values. We can copy paste this email and provide it as an email value. Let's do the same for the password. Let's copy paste here. And also I want to save it as, for example, a login request. So as you can see, we have put together a request. In this case, we are using post. And as you already know, the post means we are sending some data to the server and we are expecting the response in return. And in this case, we are like sending the data in the body of the request, and we are sending email and password with its values. So when we basically send the request on /login using post and the data, the server will perform a validation of the data we are sending in the body and send us some response. If we provide it with like valid data, it should give us a token. But if we provide it with invalid data, it should return us the error. But more to that later. So let's now take a look, and if we perform this test, we should get its status of 200. So first thing, again, site.get. So let's get the login request. And we want to assert that its status is equal to 100 because we are sending the valid data. So again, let's put that only. And if we go back to the Cypress and run the test, then we can see we have a small error because we have a typo in our assertion code. So let's go back to the VS Code. And as you can see, this should not be equal to 100, but it should equal to 100, like this. So again, some mistakes happen during the development, and as you can see, Cypress is very clever. It basically shows us the line where is the problem and what is the possible cause of the problem. Then you can simply fix it. And now, as you can see, if we go back to the test is green, and now our status code test is passing. But status code is just a first part. As you can see from documentation, when we basically submit this request, we should get the response body and its token. So let's go back here and let's create second assertion. So site.get login request .then, and you want to take the response, and in that response we should get its body, and inside its body it should be the token. So we can do expect response.body.token that to equal, and as you can see we should get this token. And as you can see, I know that the value of which is coming from the request is just token, so that's why I put the name token. I didn't console log it because I can see it from documentation what is the correct value. And now I provide it with its value, which is expected. Now let's go back to Cypress. And as you can see, also our second assertion for token is passing. So let's go back and take a look at the code. I think if you take a look on it, you should see that it's very similar to GET request, but with some exceptions. And the first one, we are calling the post. Don't forget to change the method to post. And always with the post request, you are sending some data inside its body. And after that, the server or the API endpoint will send you some response back, which you can see here. And in this case, we are getting the token value, which we can assert along with its status code. So next, let's take a look on the post request, but on the negative side, when we actually try to send some post request with some invalid data and we get error back. So again, I'm gonna remove it that only. I'm gonna create one more test. Again, API tests, post request. And let's give a description, let's say post request error. So again, this will be basically the same. So we can copy paste this request and do slight modifications. So what's the same? First, URL is the same. The method is the same, but what is different is the body. To actually simulate the error, we can remove this password from the body. And basically we will send only this email without password. And of course, you will not bypass the authentication validation. So we will get error in response that something is missing. In this case, it will be password. But as you can already remember, probably from the test here, where we actually test some negative scenarios on the error, we also need to provide it with fail on status codes, otherwise the test will fail before it provides the assertion. So fail on status code and switch it to false. So this way, our post request for error is complete. So now we can replicate the assertions. So site.get. And again, we want login request. We want to validate its status. and it should equal, and in this case we should get 400. Or if we take a look on this documentation and we take a look at login unsuccessful, you can see that we should get response 400, and when we send the email we should just get the error of missing password. So let's test that out. We do site.get, we get that login request again, .then, and we want to take the response, and from that response we want to grab its body error. So expect response.body.error to equal, and the value is missing password, just like that. So let's run that only. And now if we go back here, you can see we have post request error. We run the test, and as you can see, we hit this /API/login. We got back 400, which has been successfully asserted here. And also we have successfully asserted the error message. So let's go back, and if you compare these two requests, you can see that they are pretty much the same. But the only difference is when we are asserting something where we expect an error or status code of 400 or 500. And in this case, we always need to provide the fail on status code to false to the request to make sure that the Cypress will not kill the execution of the request and will actually continue and try to catch these values in the assertions itself and not in the error of that request. So that's pretty much it for that, and we can move on. And now let's take a look on the delete request. So far we have learned a lot about REST API testing with Cypress. We have learned how to make a lot of different API calls, how to read and validate data from responses, but we haven't talked about how to call and validate a delete request. And this one is fairly simple and straightforward, so let's dive into it. First, let's create one more test, and I'm going to give it a description of API test, and the value will be delete request. So before we start, let's take a look at our backend and to its documentation. And as you can see, if we scroll down, we have this delete endpoint. So if we open it, we can see that when we call a request of delete on /API/users and its ID, we should remove that user and get the response of 204. So let's do it. First, we want to make that request. So sci.request. First, let's provide it with that URL. In our case, it's /users. And the ID of the user, so let's use the ID of 2. Next, we need to specify the request method. In our case, it's delete. So let's give it method of delete. And last but not least, let's save it as an alias. And in this case, we can give it a name of delete user. But again, the name does not really matter here. So now we want to perform the assertion. In this case, we know that if we successfully delete the user, we should get the status of 204. So let's go sci.get, and we're going to take that alias of delete user. And we want to verify that its status code should equal, and the value is 204. And that should be it. Again, the delete request is not that complicated because you simply want to hit the request with the delete method and you should get this 204 response. So let's take a look. If we put it dot only and run just this single test, you can see when the test is executed, API test delete request, we hit the endpoint and we assert that status is 204. So a quick recapitulation. If you want to call a delete request, all you have to do is just make the call on your endpoint with the method delete, and typically you can assert that the value of the status is 204. And that's all for the delete request. So let's now continue with some more tests. So next we need to talk about put request. And put request is basically the same as post, but you only provide some data which you want to modify, So let me give you an example. So let's create one more test. API test / put request. And again, we will start with site.request. We want to provide it with the URL. So let's actually take a look what the URL looks like. And this is not what I want to show you. So we have a put here, which is an update. And as you can see, we can again call the same endpoint, but with a different method. And basically whatever methods actually not methods, but whatever values we provided to the endpoint using put will be actually modified. And we should see it in the response, and also in the response body, we should see the modified data and also when it was updated. So let's go back here. And as you can see, we can do the /users/2. We will provide it with the method of put. And we will give it some data. So body. And here I will, let's say, change the name. So the name will be, let's say, name update, just to see that it works. And again, I'm gonna save it as an alias, and let's name it put request. So our put request is pretty much prepared. Now we can perform the assertion. So again, the pattern for is always the same. Site.get, and we're gonna get that alias of put request. And we want to assert that its status should equal to 100. And also when we take the response body, we should see that the name value is changed. So again, site.get, put request, .then, and we want to take its response, and we want to assert that expect res.body.name, or not should, but to equal, and it should equal name update. So let's save it. And now if we go back to the browser, we can see that I have a small error. So let's go back and let's see what's wrong. And I see we accidentally went out of our scope of the test. So let's fix it. So this should be it. Now let's go back. And as you can see, we have one more error. So again, this can sometimes happen. Don't worry, it's very good to do errors because you can learn of them. So here, as you can see, I have a typo because I typed res.bot and it of course should be body. So let's give it one more try. So response.body.name. Now if I save it, I should hopefully have everything all right. And that's it. Now, as you can see, all our API tests are passing and our put request can be seen here. And if we take a look, we have basically called that put on this endpoint, and you can see that 200 is equal to 100, which is correct, and the name is name-update. So as you can see, the name was successfully modified as well. So let's go back. And again, as you can see, it's pretty much the same as the post request, but compared to post, put will typically modify some values. In this case, we are modifying the name of that user. And I think that's almost it. And last piece of the puzzle is, of course, show you how you can provide the access token. Because not all APIs are free to use and open and exposed such as this. Very often you will have your API like guarded by some token, and I'm gonna show you it next to you. So adding the authentication token into the request is very simple with Cypress. All you have to do is go to your request function, and let's say I have a situation where I want to call this endpoint here in that put request, and the endpoint is guarded and it requires us to have an access token. So for that, I assume I already have the token and I just want to give it to that request. So all you have to do is, let's say, or let's put it on the bottom to make it more organized. And down here, I'm gonna call out. As you can see, it's auto-completing for me. And for example, I can provide it with bearer token. And here I simply provided the token value. And now if I submit the request, it will basically go with this authentication using this bearer token. And that's pretty much it. And I told you, using authentication and access token is very simple. You just need to get your token. Typically you will get him by some request. When you call some post request, which will return your token. I think we could see it here. And after that, you put the token, store it into the variable, and in the next request, you will provide it to the Cypress, and it will let you through the application. So that's all. And I think this is it for the REST API testing with Cypress part. And I hope you have learned a lot of cool stuff. And eventually I will be putting much more topics and videos. But I think that's all to wrap the basics. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I will try to help or to answer your questions. So thank you guys.